start us off. Thank you. The Wilderness of Lament. We are in the second week of Lent. Our sermon series is The Wilderness of Lent, Finding God in the Unknown. Throughout this series, we've been exploring the wilderness, what it means to journey through it, what we encounter there, and how God meets us in that space. Last week, we reflected on how the wilderness reveals a truth of who we are in God. Today, we turn to another aspect of the wilderness of lament. This is the place where we confront the brokenness of our lives and of the world around us. It is a space of grief, where sorrow and longing rise to the surface. Yet, it is also here that we learn the sacred practice of lament, the act of bringing our pain, our questions, and our deepest cries before God. Lament is not weakness. It is an act of profound trust, a way of standing before God with raw honesty, knowing that He meets us in our brokenness.
Number 2, Jesus' lament over Jerusalem. In Luke 13:34, Jesus cries out, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often have I longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings." These words are heavy with sorrow. Jesus is grieving because Jerusalem, the city he loves, has repeatedly rejected God's messengers, the prophets sent to guide and save them. Now they are rejecting him, the one who has come to bring them peace and restoration. Jesus' lament is not just about his own impending suffering. It is about the pain of unreturned love. He longs to gather his people, to protect them, to offer them shelter and safety, but they are unwilling. In his grief, we see the heart of God, a heart that aches for his people, even when they turn away. This is a God who does not stand at a distance from our pain, but enters into it, feeling the weight of our brokenness alongside us.
Number 3, God weeps with us. When Jesus stood with Mary and Martha after Lazarus' death, he wept. Even though he knew resurrection was coming, he entered fully our pain or offers easy answers. Instead, God meets us in our sorrow, weeping with us and reminding us we are not alone.
Lament as a spiritual discipline. Lament is more than an expression of sadness. It is a spiritual discipline. It is the act of bringing our pain unto God's presence and trusting that He can hold it. In the wilderness of Lent, we are invited to slow down and confront what is broken, not just in the world, but within ourselves. Henry Nouwen reminds us that the solitude we realize, the roots of all conflicts, war, injustice, cruelty, hatred, jealousy, and envy are deeply anchored in our own hearts. Through this honesty, we open ourselves to God's healing and transformation.
The raw honesty of lament. Lament invites us into a kind of honesty that can feel uncomfortable. Too often, we feel pressure to present a polished version of faith, to act as if we have it all together, as if doubt and sorrow have no place in our walk with God. But lament teaches us that faith is not about having easy answers or pretending that everything is fine. It's about bringing everything to God. Our anger, our grief, our confusion, even our questions about where He is in our pain. This kind of raw honesty is the essence of true faith. It shows that we trust God enough to bring Him our pain, our questions, and our brokenness, believing that He will meet us with love and grace. In the wilderness of Lent, we are invited to lay down the masks we wear and stand before God as we are, knowing that He sees us, loves us, and will not turn us away.
Number 6, Lament and waiting. Lament often involves waiting, a kind of waiting that can feel heavy and uncertain. We cry out, "How long, O Lord?" And sometimes the answer is silence. Yet that silence, God is at work. Waiting is not passive. It is an act of trust, a choice to believe that God is present even when we cannot see the way forward. In the wilderness of Lent, we are reminded that the waiting is part of the journey. And just as Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness, leaning into the Father's timing, we too are called to wait with hope. Lament stretches our faith, teaches us to rest in God's promises rather than our own understanding. It is in the waiting that we learn to rely on His faithfulness, even when the path is ahead and is clear.
Lament and hope. Lament does not erase grief, but it transforms it. It is a refusal to let despair have the final word. When we lament, we name our sorrow honestly. We cry out, we question, we wrestle, but we do so while clinging to the promise that God is with us, even in the pain. Lament is not a denial of hurt. It is an act of hope, a way of saying, this hurts, and I don't understand it, but I trust that God is here with me. Henry Nouwen writes, our brokenness is the wound through which the full power of God can penetrate our being and transfigure us in God's light. This is the paradox of lament. It is in our honesty about brokenness that God's healing light enters. When we bring our pain to God, we open ourselves to His transforming presence. How do we live this out? Start by naming what hurts. Write it down, pray it out loud, or simply sit with it in God's presence. Then remind yourself of God's promises, His faithfulness, His love, His power to redeem. Lament is not just about looking back at what's broken. It's about looking forward to what God can do. Even in the wilderness, even in the waiting, hope is alive because God is with us.
What are you lamenting? Take a moment to pause and reflect. What sorrow are you carrying today? Is it a personal loss, a grief that still aches, a dream that feels out of reach? Is it a broken relationship that seems beyond repair? Is it a deeper frustration with the world, the injustice, the division, the suffering that feels overwhelming? The invitation of lament is to bring these burdens before God. Like the psalmist, we can cry out in anguish, protest, and sorrow, trusting that God hears us. What would it look like for you to name your pain honestly today? To bring it to God's presence and say, this is what hurts. This is what I'm carrying. We'll now take a moment of silence to allow you to do this, to write it down, pray it silently, or simply sit with it in God's presence. Lisa will start us again in a moment. Lament begins when we stop pretending that everything is fine and start trusting God with what's broken. It will follow 2 minutes of silence.
Number 9, practicing lament. You have just named something, a grief, a pain, a question. Maybe it feels heavy. Maybe it feels raw. Or maybe it's just the beginning of putting words to something you've carried for a long time. Whatever it is, this is not the end of the process. Lament is not something we resolve in a single moment. It's a practice we return to, a way of being honest with God over time. So, what do you do with what you've written? First, create space for silence and solitude. Take it home with you, and in the days ahead, find moments to sit with it in God's presence. You don't have to rush to fix it or figure it out. Simply bring it to Him again and again and let Him meet you there. Second, pray honestly. Tell God exactly how you feel. Name your pain, ask your questions, and don't hold back. The Psalms show us that God can handle our anger, our doubt, and our cries of, why? Lament is not about having the right words, it's about having real words. Finally, hold on to hope. Lament does not mean resigning to despair, but entrusting our brokenness to the one who promises to redeem all things. This doesn't mean the pain will disappear overnight, but it means we will not be alone in it. God is with us, and He is at work even when we cannot see it. In the weeks ahead, let this be your practice. Return to what you've written, bring it to God, and trust that He is walking with you through the wilderness. Lament is not a quick fix, but it is a lifeline, a way of staying connected to God in the midst of our pain.
Number 10, Jesus' example of lament. Judy, can you hold the microphone? Number 10, Jesus' example of lament. Even in his final moments on the cross, Jesus lamented, crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" These words, raw and aching, remind us that lament is not a failure of faith. It is a natural and necessary part of our journey. If Jesus, the Son of God, could express his grief, sadness, and even his sense of abandonment so openly, how much more should we? Jesus' lament shows us that grief, anger, confusion, and doubt are not things to hide or suppress. They are emotions to bring into the light, to offer to God in honesty and trust. His cry from the cross is a reminder that even in our darkest moments, when we feel lost, angry, or overwhelmed, God is not distant. He is present, hearing our cries and holding our pain. Lament is not a sign of weak faith. It is a bold act of trust. It is saying, I don't understand this, and it hurts, but I believe you are here with me. In the wilderness of our own grief, sadness, or confusion, we can follow Jesus' example, bringing our sorrow to God, knowing that He meets us in it and walks with us through it.
Lament is not the end of the story, but it is a necessary part of the journey. Jesus lamented over Jerusalem, but he pressed forward towards the cross, towards resurrection. In the same way, our lament leads us somewhere. It doesn't erase the pain, but it transforms how we carry it. When we bring our grief, anger, confusion, and doubt to God, something shifts within us. We begin to see that our emotions are not too big or too messy for Him. He meets us in our honesty, not with judgment, but with love. Over time, as we return to Him again and again with our pain, we are changed. Our hearts become softer, our trust deeper, and our hope more resilient. The transformation doesn't happen overnight. It is a slow, often painful process of learning to rest in God's presence, even when the answers don't come quickly. But as we lament, we begin to see glimpses of his goodness, not because the pain is gone, but because we know he is with us. The wilderness of lament is not a dead end, it is a doorway. It leads us to a deeper intimacy with God, a deeper understanding of his love, and ultimately to hope. Hope does not mean the absence of pain, but the presence of God. And in his presence, we find the strength to keep walking, even when the path is hard.
Number 12, lament as community. Lament is not just a personal practice, it is something we do together. When we share our grief, anger, and confusion with others, we create space for God's healing to move in our midst. The church is called to be a place where we can lament together, where no one has to carry their pain alone. When Jesus wept at Lazarus' tomb, he wasn't alone. Mary, Martha, and the community were there grieving with him. In the same way, we are called to bear one another's burdens, to weep with those who weep, and to remind each other that we are not alone. Lamenting together strengthens our bonds as a community and reminds us that God's love is often more made tangible through the care of others.
Lament and justice. Lament is not only about personal grief, it is also about the brokenness of the world. When we see injustice, suffering, and division, lament moves us to cry out to God and to act. It is both a prayer and a protest, a way of saying this is not how it should be, and trusting that God will bring his justice and restoration. The prophets of old lamented over the sins of their people and the suffering of the oppressed. But their cries were not passive. They were calls to action, urging God's people to turn back to him and to care for the vulnerable. In the same way, our lament over the world's brokenness should move us to pray, to speak up, and to work for change. Lament is not just about feeling that pain, it's about joining God in his work of healing and restoration.
Lament as worship. Lament is an act of worship. It is a way of saying, God, I trust you enough to bring you my pain. When we lament, we acknowledge that God is sovereign, even when life feels out of control. In our honesty, we honor him as the one who can handle our deepest emotions and transform them into something beautiful. The Psalms of Lament are filled with raw emotion, yet they often end with declarations of trust and praise. This is the heart of lament as worship. It begins in pain, but points us toward God's faithfulness. When we bring our brokenness to him, we are saying, you are worthy of my honesty, and I believe you are good, even when life is hard. In this way, lament becomes a profound act of faith and worship.
15. The promise of resurrection. Lament leads us to hope because it reminds us the resurrection is coming. Just as Jesus wept before raising Lazarus, our grief is not the final word. God is making all things new. As we continue our Lenten journey, may we have the courage to bring our brokenness to God, knowing that even in lament, we are held. The wilderness of lament is not a dead end. It is a pathway to hope. It teaches us to trust in God's promises, even when we cannot see the way forward. And it reminds us that the story does not end in sorrow. Resurrection is coming. God is at work, redeeming all things, and one day every tear will be wiped away.
Finally, as we close this time together, let us hold on to this truth. Lament is not the end of the story. It is a sacred practice, a way of bringing our plan, our pain, our questions, and our brokenness to God, trusting that he is with us in the wilderness. Take what you have written, what you've reflected on, and carry it with you in the days ahead. Return to it in prayer, in silence, and in community. Let it remind you that you are not alone, that God hears your cries, and that he is at work, even when you cannot see it. May we leave this place with the courage to lament, to be honest with God, to weep with one another, and to hold on to hope. For even in the wilderness, even in the waiting, God is with us, and he is making all things new.